it didn't make any sense because I've had a perfect life in many, many ways. I have a career that I love. I have a loving wife. We have a wonderful home. And I have a successful career in something that I feel I can actually do. And so it puzzled me why these things were still roiling around in my unconscious. And I felt the need for more psychoanalysis. I'd had 12 years with a wonderful analyst when I was young, but I was too young to appreciate it. It wasn't really, you couldn't really call it psychoanalysis, what I went through. It was just more like finally having a dad who cared about me. And, but the fact is that Sarah and I live on a prairie out in the middle of nowhere and hundreds of miles away from that kind of help. And so I realized that I was going to have to do this myself if it was going to get done. And so I started drawing out my memories at random, just a hurly-burly of memories coming back, and not in any particular order. And as I started drawing my family, I developed this technique. It was kind of a visual mnemonic technique of remembering just one thing. If I couldn't remember a room, I would try to remember just one thing in a room, like a lampshade. And if I could draw that, then I could usually draw the lamp that was coming out of it, and the table under that, and then suddenly I would see the carpet underneath me, underneath the table, and the pattern on it, and then suddenly the room began to furnish itself, and once the rooms were furnished, then the ghosts started coming back in and going through their acts.
You reference in an earlier interview a quote by the French filmmaker Sylvain Chomet.
Yes.
Right. The memory improves the more you lay burdens on it.
Oh yeah. He didn't say that, but that was actually De Quincey who said
I
that.
love that quote.
Yeah.
That's an amazing quote to me.
Yeah, it was, yeah, especially wonderful for a 60-year-old man to find, you know, this is the age when our memories are supposed to be getting shot full of holes, and I'm certainly one of those people who had sometimes thought that mine were, but I think that's true now. At any rate, what really spurred this book into being, finally, from a psychological standpoint, was that when I started bringing my mother back to life, I could feel her aura around me again. And when I felt her really rather malevolent presence in my life again, I began acting out. Sarah could tell you all sorts of horror stories, I'm sure, about my erratic behavior. And one night we were at a restaurant, and I was sitting there with my hand like this, and I suddenly could feel, because of the tension, I could feel my neck. It felt like my neck was swelling underneath my hand. And then I thought, this has got to be a hallucination. But then when I look up and I saw Sarah's face, which had just gone completely pale, I knew that it was happening. That my neck was swelling up exactly as it had when I had cancer, and in the same place. And the lump that had taken 12 years to develop in my neck was suddenly coming back in a matter of moments. And I looked at Sarah and she said, "Darling, what's wrong?" She reached across the table and took my arm. I said, "I don't know." And she shoved a glass of wine at me and she said, "Drink this." And I drank it down really quickly. And then I excused myself and I went into the bathroom because I couldn't believe this was really happening. And I stood there in the men's room looking at my neck swollen up again with this tremendous lump. And I realized that if I didn't get this stuff out in some healthy way, in other words, through writing or art, that it was going to kill me. That my body was expressing what I refused to express emotionally. And that was the moment I decided that I had to do this book, and that I had to get serious about it, and that I had to stop asking for help on it. I had to just do it by myself.
Carlotta Monterey O'Neill, Eugene O'Neill's widow, writes in her memoir about what it was like in Tow House over in Berkeley when O'Neill was writing the script to his last play, Long Day's Journey into Night. And she said that all she could do was stand outside the room and wring her hands while she would hear him. I know where we're going. Right, like, see, Sarah. All she could do was stand outside the room while he was inside, crying, gnashing his teeth. She could hear the crumpling of papers. She'd give him tea when he came out, but she knew she couldn't knock. She knew she couldn't come in. How strong of a marriage do you have, man, to survive this? I mean, it's astonishing to me to think that a partnership can go through the level of painful introspection that you must have gone through and still be there at the end, and Sarah knowing, you know, when to be there and when to step away. And I know I've got that right. I'm not projecting anything on
It's
that.
really a question for Sarah. I can't answer. I have no idea what it was like to live with me.
It must have been awful.
It wasn't easy, I'm sure.
Yeah. So I think of the memoirist turning his life into his art. And we live in a culture right now where memoir is deeply suspect. So many people are worried. You know, I mean, memoir is. I think I quoted this, but if somebody else says this, I'll happily give the attribution away. But I'm very fond of saying to students and other librarians that memoir is the triumph of the unreliable narrator. Because in a memoir, it's just your version of what happened.
Yeah.
So I know there's a story about how you checked in to make sure that what you were remembering was real. You want to tell it?
Thank you for that. Yeah. About 2 years ago, in February, when I was still deep into making this book, but getting sort of a handle on it finally, my editor at Norton, Bob Weil, called me up, and he said, "David, have you seen the cover of the New York? Have you seen the front page of the Times today?" And I said, "Bob, I live on a prairie in Michigan. Get that." He said, "Well, it's online now, so go check it out. And I'm not even going to tell you what the article is. You'll know when you see it, and call me back after you've read it." And so I went and I checked it out, and there was this article about a woman who had written a book. I don't even know the name of it, but I think she lives in Portland, Oregon now, and she had written a book about growing up in LA in a drive-by shooting neighborhood with lots of violence and drugs and so on. And when it was published, her sister had called the Washington Post and said, "This is all a fabrication. It's a complete lie." She grew up in Los Angeles in the most privileged situation possible, and so by the time I read this article, the publisher was shredding 75,000 copies of the book, and the woman had been on TV and crying and trying to explain her error. But I called my editor back, and Bob said, "David, I know this has nothing to do with you and your story. I know your story is completely truthful, but as your editor, I have to remind you that I work for a company whose interests I have to protect, and so I have to ask you a difficult question. Is there anybody still alive who might have experienced these same events and remembered them very differently from the way you do?" And I said, "Well, I do have this brother." And he said, "Have you shown it to him?" I said, "No, it's not done." He said, "Well, you have to show it to him." I said, "It's not done. I told him about it. You know, he's in it as a child. I didn't write about his life. I don't have any right to do that. But no, I haven't shown it to him, and I don't want to show it to him." And he said, "Well, you must." And I said, "Bob, listen, the last time I had a discussion with my brother of any length, I told him to go and I told him I didn't want to have anything to do with him. I never wanted to hear from him again. And he felt much the same way. We made the agreement not to do that. And he said, "Well, that's all the more reason why you have to show him the book." And so my brother's wife had died 2 months before this, and I thought maybe looking at the book would, you know, take his mind off his current problems. And so we piled up a bunch of Xeroxes and sent them to him. And I gave him 4 days to read this book. You can actually read in 20 minutes. And I called him back up, and I said, "Well, what did you think?" And there was this long, dreadful pause on the other end of the line, and then my brother spoke in these tones that reminded me so much of my father. These kind of sepulchral Nixonian tones. Said, David, your book blew me away. He said, it's as if you made a snapshot of my youth. He said, I can't believe you did it. It's sad and it's funny and you got the people exactly the way they were. They looked the same. I couldn't believe it. And then he talked on a bit about it some more, and then he asked if he could show it to his therapist and to his sons. And I congratulated him on being in therapy, and said, of course, show everybody, because it'll probably explain a lot about you. Because he went through the same thing I did, in his way.
In his way.
Yeah.